Good morning, and welcome to Daily 15. It's good to have you back. Today's Daily 15 is titled Williams on Self-Indulgence, and it comes from an excerpt from a paper by Bernard Williams in which he explores the charge that we sometimes levy upon people who refuse to do something because they find it morally distasteful. They don't want to get their hands dirty. If you'd like to purchase Williams' book or read along with us and read the annotations yourself, you can head to alifeofthought.com/D15. Or if you'd like to join the conversation, you can head to community.alifeofthought.com. Remember, what I say here is not supposed to be the last word, it's supposed to be the first one. So get over there and say some more words. It's free to make an account. community.alifeofthought.com. With that being said, let's get into the paragraph. Williams begins. It is this type of reflexive concern which, I suggest, is significantly related to the charge of moral self-indulgence. It can arise with any moral motivation whatsoever. Thus, a person may act from generosity or loyalty and act in a counter-utilitarian way and not attract the charge of moral self-indulgence, but that charge will be attracted if the suspicion is that his act is motivated by a concern for his own generosity or loyalty, the enhancement or preservation of his own self-image as a generous or loyal person. In the case of a man who acts in a counter-utilitarian way for reasons not of the moral kind, the charge of self-indulgence will not in any case stick, since moral is not the sort of self-indulgence, if any, that he is going in for. But there are highly analogous contrasts in the matter of reflexivity. It is one thing for a man to act in a counter-utilitarian way out of his great love for Isolde. Another for him to do so out of concern for his image of himself as a great Tristan. The distinction applies even to the case of selfishness. One can act selfishly, that is to say, in a manner motivated by a desire of things for oneself and indifferently to the welfare of others, but it would be different from that to act from a conception of oneself as a person who so acts. While the latter is unlikely to be nicer, it has a chance of being a bit grander. So we'll get started with our highlighted phrase. Williams says, to the charge of moral self-indulgence. And as is becoming more and more usual, we will benefit by understanding the context in which Williams is talking about self-indulgence and really just what the heck he means by self-indulgence. To start, it's going to help us to look at the definition, the dictionary definition of self-indulgence. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, to be self-indulgent is to, quote, allow oneself to indulge or gratify one's own desires or inclinations, especially with regard to pleasure or comfort. Formally, it's also meant having regard for one's own interests or well-being. So there's this sort of priority for one's own desires, one's own interests, one's own self. So we're sort of saying that such a person is acting selfishly. The charge of self-indulgence Williams is interested in is the one that commonly arises in questions of moral hypotheticals. So this is sort of the context in which someone makes the charge, which he is in this paper trying to understand. So for instance, someone asks me whether I would kill one person or let them die, maybe, to save 1 million people. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a short story about this that you might be familiar with. Imagine that after thinking about it for a while, I respond, no, I would not save the million. I could not kill the one. And when my friend asks me why I wouldn't do so, we might imagine in this case that I say something like the following. I can't be a killer. I can't be a killer. I would rather not act and let something bad happen than to fall to that level of immorality. I can't imagine myself as a killer. And the charge of self-indulgence comes in because we almost want to call a person who says this selfish. Namely, we might feel that they're putting their own moral character, sort of their own purity, above the lives of the 1 million people that they could save simply by making the hard choice. And that we feel this way is often used by utilitarians as a point in favor of their view. They say that the people who don't agree with us are simply self-indulgent, right? That's sort of a reason that you should come over to utilitarianism, to join their camp. The people who don't put their own projects and cares and character aside for the bigger moral picture, they're all making the same moral mistake. They're all self-indulgent. It's this second move that Williams wants to hold under the microscope in this paper. And though these two excerpts and this Daily 15 don't specifically focus on his defense against the utilitarians, Williams's goal is to figure out what exactly this charge is. What is this charge? What is this claim that someone is being self-indulgent? And what exactly are we accusing them of when we call a person self-indulgent? Is it a strictly moral failing, for instance? And this brings us right to the steps of our underlined phrase. Williams says of the self-indulgent person, the suspicion is that his act is motivated by a concern for his own generosity or loyalty. Now, this is Williams's first pass at trying to say what exactly the mistake is that the self-indulgent person makes. After all, the issue can't simply be that they're not utilitarians, right? If utilitarians in the first place want to use the charge of self-indulgence as an argument for their view, which they do, even if we're not going to get into that much today, then it's going to need to be a mistake that can be characterized independently of utilitarianism. In plain English, then, Williams wants to say, without using any sort of language that's loaded with one moral theory or another, what our problem is with this self-indulgent person. And philosophically, it's really important that we're able to characterize, independently of utilitarianism, what it is, what the mistake is that the self-indulgent person makes. After all, many of the recipients of the charge are going to be people who aren't utilitarians. They're people who don't recognize utilitarianism as the true moral theory. But if the charge of self-indulgence is a mistake that only makes sense to someone who believes in utilitarianism, then there's sort of no reason to call people who aren't utilitarians self-indulgent. Of course they're self-indulgent. They're not utilitarians. Presumably, when we criticize someone for being selfish in the way that we're talking about here, we're saying more than simply, oh, you don't agree with the tenets of utilitarianism. What we're saying is more basic. It's simpler than that. And that's what Williams wants to get to the bottom of. Great. And what Williams proposes then, in line with that, is that the self-indulgent person's thinking is characterized not by a concern for other people, but for their very own character. They're not concentrating on doing the generous thing or being a generous person, but with their own generosity itself. Now, this distinction is going to be a bit hard to see at first, so it's going to help us to work with an example to make it more concrete. Imagine three people. The first person has a cause they believe in. And because they care about this cause, they donate 10%. They're very generous. They donate 10% of their yearly income to it. Now, when they make the decision to do this, they're not thinking about generosity at all. And by that, I mean the word is not coming into their head. They're simply thinking about the good that their money is going to be able to affect. So for instance, imagine that their focus is entirely on the children who will be helped by their donations. Why do they do it? Well, they're not thinking about being generous. They're thinking about buying the bike for that kid or helping that family afford a Thanksgiving dinner. Now, let's imagine a second person who also wants to be generous. This person knows of the same charity and is trying to decide whether or not to donate to it. Now, this person might ask themselves, what would a good or generous person do in my shoes? What would someone who isn't selfish do? And if the answer to that question for them in their mind is to donate to such and such charity, then they decide to do it. Now, this person still isn't self-indulgent in the problematic way. Yes, they're thinking about virtues and morality, but they're also doing so in a way that I think is somewhat healthy and totally normal. They're trying to be a more generous and good person, and so they're asking themselves, if it was a generous and good person in my shoes, what would she do? But now, let's turn to our third person. This person, too, decides to donate to the charity, but they don't come to this decision on the basis of their care for the children or an aspiration to be better, to be a more generous person. No, they have an image of themselves as generous. They have this image, this self-image in their head, and that's what they wish to protect. So rather than make the decision because it will help the children or because it is the generous decision, they decide to donate because they want to themselves be generous. And they can't stand, they want to think of themselves as generous, and they can't stand the possibility of sullying themselves, their image, of coming off as selfish. They don't want to look that way. Their concern is, Williams says, not about children or even about being generous in the first place, but about themselves being generous. They want to preserve their image of themselves as a generous person. This is self-indulgence, and it certainly leaves an odd taste in our mouth. And that brings us to our circled phrase. Williams says, but there are highly analogous contrasts in the matter of reflexivity. Now, Williams here is making an important qualification, which is that this kind of self-obsessiveness is not limited to morality. We're not only self-indulgent about our moral character. The example of love really helps to draw this out. It's one thing to make a sacrifice or do something for a loved one because of who they are themselves, because it's my wife. And it is quite a different thing to make the very same choice because we want to maintain an image of ourselves as a person who will make such sacrifices in the name of love. We want to think of ourselves as this hopeless romantic. That's different from actually being a hopeless romantic. Like in the case of generosity, the outcome is perhaps acceptable here, but we're still left with the feeling that the decision maker is still far too self-obsessed to be doing anything commendable. And now what's important here is that Williams is going to take this to be a lesson about the nature of deliberation in general. It's not uncommon for philosophers to imagine that, acting in a loving way or acting in a generous way involves love or generosity figuring explicitly into some person's thought process about what to do. Donating to charity would help these children. A generous person would donate to charity. I want to be a generous person, so I'm going to donate. That's maybe what we might call a conventional philosophical thought process about how a generous person thinks. But now we're sort of in the position to see that it's clearly self-indulgent in precisely the objectionable way that we've been discussing. And so Williams' point here is partially a broader one about the nature of deliberation and thinking about what to do in general. Maybe we're putting too much focus on the names of virtues, on generosity or love specifically, because these names and our focus on these names coming up explicitly in our thinking results in this weird self-indulgent reflexive picture. And this is so perhaps because what it is to be generous or to act in a loving way has nothing, or at least very little, to do with one's explicit chain of reasoning. The things that someone tells him or herself. Rather, being loving or being generous is much more tied up in the way that one thinks about what one does. The sense in which one's attention is directed towards certain people, towards the children he wishes to help, towards the problems that they face, or towards the person that he loves. It is unnecessary, and I think part of that kind of philosophy, which has a tendency to hyper-intellectualize, to expect that the names we use, things like love or generosity, must play central roles in the phenomena or in deliberation about the actions which they describe. And that leaves us with our second paragraph. Williams says, these remarks about reflexivity and moral motivation involve a claim about a question which is hard and important and has been inadequately studied. How are we to picture the expression of moral dispositions in an agent's deliberative thought? We have some views and philosophy about the reference to dispositions in explaining and evaluating other people's conduct. We have some views about the occurrence of moral considerations and practical deliberation, though they're largely restricted to questions about the function and deliberation of quote-unquote moral judgments. What we seem to lack, however, is any coherent representation of something which is certainly true, that distinctive moral dispositions, such as generosity, are expressed in the content, and not just the occasions, of the agent's deliberations. The one claim that I make about that subject here is that the characteristic and basic expression of a moral disposition in deliberation is not a premise which refers to that disposition. It is not the basic characteristic of a generous man's deliberation that they use the premise, I am a generous man. Whatever one goes on to say about this subject, that negative claim is surely correct. Though the generous man is partly characterized by what goes into his deliberations, it is not that what goes into them are reflections on his generosity. If only we had another 15 minutes. If you'd like to mark the second paragraph up yourself, you can head on over to alifeofthought.com/D15. If you have any disagreements, questions, confusions, share them on community.alifeofthought.com. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.